So, Brian, you were the first American that worked at Alibaba, the 52nd employee, and a special assistant to Jack Ma. So you've seen some things, we should say. What do you think is Alibaba and Jack Ma's secret sauce?
Well, Emily, I wrote this book because I really wanted to share what my understanding and perception was from the nearly 20 years I was with the company about, the essence of sort of Jack Ma and Alibaba. And I think, to put it in very basic terms is Jack really was able to build a company around a very deep purpose of solving the world's problems. He created a culture that was very optimistic and positive, and he was able to align an organization to all focus on that mission, but at the same time give them the flexibility to adapt to the constantly changing world and the industry that it's operating in order for it to become successful. So I've seen the company recreate itself over and over these last 20 years, and I think really at the essence of it was what I call the Tao, but it's really this kind of really strong mission-driven and purpose-driven organization and culture that Jack helped to create.
So the question is, can Alibaba reinvent itself again? When the company tried to globalize a few years back, it didn't quite work. Should Alibaba revive those ambitions now? And will it work when there's others pushing for de-globalization?
Well, one of the amazing things about the company throughout its history is how resilient it's been. When it was very small, it faced some existential crises. Before COVID, there was something called SARS, and it was a very small company. And the company actually mobilized itself without even the direction of the leaders, but the staff came together and figured out ways to keep the company operating in its early years, but also to launch what we now know as one of the major retail businesses called Taobao during a lockdown period when you didn't have the conveniences that we have today in terms of mobile connectivity and devices. So I believe that the company, with its DNA and the culture that's been really established and institutionalized with Alibaba, it does have great potential to continue to grow, but also, as you asked, globalize. Yes, I think that the world now really needs some positive forces that utilize things like technology to actually improve society and, frankly, to solve a lot of the problems that we're facing, not just in the developed world, but in the emerging markets.
That said, China's COVID-0 policies have had a myriad of potentially negative impacts when you're talking about the supply chain and basic consumer demand and execution. Yeah. Some people say Alibaba's glory days are over. What do you think?
Sure. Well, look, I think the challenges of zero COVID and the supply chain are more of a larger national issue that needs to be resolved. And I think the country is trying to work through that. We may agree or disagree with how they're handling it, but really this is something that needs to take place on a national level. And then eventually, the companies can get back on their feet and do the things they need to do. I do think, though, this experience has really built up really strong capacity in terms of dealing with uncertainty. And if you look at how companies like Alibaba, were able to adapt to the situation over the years, I think they're going to come out stronger once this is all done.
The question is, though, how does big tech survive in President Xi's China? When Beijing cracked down on the Ant IPO, it basically put a scarlet letter on Alibaba and Jack Ma himself. What's the way out?
Well, look, I think the anti-IPO situation was one of a string of events that happened, and probably, it was so high profile because it was at the start of this kind of change in policy. But also, yes, it was a very major decision and quite sudden. But I do think that, what this really indicates is a shift in terms of government policy, one that was previously a kind of a late touch sort of governance model where it allowed for room for innovation, to one where it's more heavily regulated. But this is a global issue. If you think about what we're dealing with now in the upcoming Supreme Court decisions in terms of antitrust and privacy and these issues, this is America. In Europe, we're dealing with this, and also China. And this is where big tech has become, big and influential and governments are trying to figure out how to manage this. So I do think that each respective country and its governments will figure out the solution or the policy for that. But I do think if you're asking about opportunities down the road, there are definitely new opportunities in the market, in higher quality sort of industries or areas. China is essentially trying to upgrade its industrial capacity, and how companies can play in those spaces is really going to be the secret to their future growth and success if they can really tap into that.
Jack Ma still hasn't been seen publicly in some time. When is the last time you spoke with him? Where do you think he is, and how is he doing?
Well, I've been in touch with Jack, throughout the last 2 years and in communication, and he's been free to move around. He's been laying low, obviously. He's traveled abroad. People have mentioned they've seen him in Europe and other places in Asia, but I think he's really. Emily, he's gearing up for his next act, which is really around philanthropy, education, helping those areas that really need assistance. And it's a passion of his is to really help those who are kind of the more marginalized parts of society to really get on their feet, rural communities, but also learning. I think he was doing a lot of learning tours in his last 2 years. So I think he's okay, but I think that a lot of people have been wondering, and hopefully at some point, he will have his next sort of, big thing to come out in terms of what he wants to do in philanthropy, and people will know.
Well, wondering, and rightly so. I mean, he was so out there. He was a frequent guest on this show.
Yes.
He loved talking to the press. Here's the last question. Obviously, U.S.-China tensions are escalating. How is that going to play a role in whether Alibaba succeeds in this new world or not?
Well, look, I think it's still in process. I think the countries are battering, really buckling down and trying to figure out what's their best policy in the interest of national security. And unfortunately, sometimes that means that the relationships turn very tense and challenging. But I really do hope that, as many of the diplomats and the politicians have mentioned, that the key here is to continue to engage and compete at the same time. There are key issues on a global basis that China and U.S. need to cooperate on, and I think that those are actually more important in the long run than these disputes that we're facing that are kind of creating that tension. So I'm confident that with the G20 coming up, hopefully there will be some dialogue between the two governments, however that may turn out. But that these two countries need to continue to collaborate. Yeah.